Hey guys, I'm Amaroth and I think that it's time to stop talking about terrain and that it's time to start talking about model spawns or about doodads. And we'll start with generic spawn. Well, what is generic spawn for me? Well, those are trees, rocks, bushes, grass, flowers. So generic things which are around us, which are making a sort of environment around us, but which aren't really unique in their own way. There's just huge amount of them. So let's start with trees. In general, I always try to pick some trees and in general models which are matching my textures. So I want some rocks which are matching those rock textures. I want some trees which look alright on this texture and so on. Just a quick note here, you don't need to use the same textures. You can always just pick some texture swap it for something different. Let's say for something from Grizzly Hills or from Hollingfjord. And let's say that okay, we'll use this one. If you don't like the previous one, we'll use this one. So we can always swap your textures to get it either if you don't like it or if you want it to match your models. For example, trees. So let's pick some trees. As we got textures mainly from Hollingfjord and from Grizzly Hills, I will use trees from there. You don't really need to use models from zone from which you have textures. You can even make your own textures in Photoshop and so on. It's perfectly fine. But it's a good start. It's a good place to start with, a zone from which you've got your textures. So let's use these trees. We'll just import them here to be able to see them in Nugget. Okay, let's not use these and good ones. These are for, I don't know, for placing on kind of mountains and rocks. By the way, not just trees, let's also pick fallen trees and stumps and similar models. Those can be very useful, at least sometimes. And I think that I have already more than enough trees, so I won't even try to look in grizzly hills or in different zones. Well, the first thing you always should make sure is that those trees match each other, that they don't look completely different and completely varied when you put them next to each other like this. Well, for example, some are quite small and some big. So let's start with scale issues. Scale issues are quite easy to deal with. You can obviously just scale up some trees and some down and so on, but you should really consult this with our expert, with our human scale, our best friend, human scale. And one of my viewers had an idea to give our human scale a name, so I have decided to not use his name, Alfred. I have decided to make up my own main name, and that's Hugo. So this is Hugo, meet Hugo. Hi Hugo. And tell me Hugo, aren't those trees a little bit too big? Well, I think that Hugo thinks that trees are just humongous, so let's scale them down. And to make those trees, well, you don't really need to get real scale because World of Warcraft isn't really about real scaled things. You can have oversized things in World of Warcraft. You just want to, to not overdo it. So now we've got quite reasonable scale. And well, this model definitely doesn't match those others very well, so let's get rid of it. Well, this one is a little bit weird as well, so let's filter it a little bit. And these are, I would say, quite okay. So let's use these. In general, I tend to use 3, 4 or more tree modules. So 3 are enough, but 3 are really getting quite low. 4 or 5 are just perfectly fine. When you are using more different models, you can get into issue that your models are a little bit too much scattered, that there is too big diversity in your forest. So try to avoid having too many different models, but you definitely at the same time don't want to use just one model. Just a quick example, what I have seen already before was forest, which was looking like this. And just just no, guys, please don't do this. This looks terrible. Those are just copy paste trees with well different rotations, and I may even turn random tilt on and random scale on, but it won't really help. It will look a little bit dull if you make whole forest like this. It doesn't work, or don't do it. So try to make use of multiple models. So let's use some of those, this one, and this isn't still enough, so let's change scale as well so it isn't too repetitive. Let's use this one, let's create another one which is just huge and then some very small one, and often I am not happy with what the random scale and rotation and tilt does. So results can be fine, but sometimes you want to move some model a little bit, to scale it down or scale it up, to rotate it a little bit, to tilt it a little bit into different directions. So don't be afraid to well spawn a model and then toy around with it a little bit afterwards as well. So try to mix different tree models into each other. What Blizzard very often uses are these sort of groups. They are grouping models. But though in general Blizzard tends to use huge trees and they either place them into groups or they just place huge trees which are absolutely huge. They are like going to sky and they keep space between those trees. So players can go through that space and so maps well don't get too laggy. So try to avoid lags, try to avoid having too many models around, and so there aren't too big FPS drops and so on. Let's also use some phone logs around. This is really just enough. You don't need to get too fancy. Just keep in mind that you will have to make huge forests sometimes. Sometimes you need to cover whole ADTs with forest, with trees and with bushes and tree trunks and fallen logs and so on and so forth. So sometimes you can't even afford to be too fancy with it and go too much into detail because it would just drive you crazy. And I got to say that spawning or making generic spawns in general can drive me crazy sometimes, or nearly crazy at least. Yet another quite useful type of model, if I can find it, I'm probably blind now. Can you see roots? Ah, here. Okay. Roots models can be very useful. But especially when you start using roots, it just gets absolutely tedious and really I don't use roots very often, but sometimes I use them. I will show you in which cases later in different video. But you can definitely use roots as well. It just gets quite tedious afterwards. So these were trees and roots and logs and stumps and so on. And the most important thing is that these models should match to your textures. This doesn't really match very well, so let's change that texture. Let's use something that looks reasonable. Well, this maybe. That's a little bit too bright, but I would personally change this texture. I would go to Photoshop and change its hue a little bit. But whatever. Let's make use of what we've got already. Ah, that's ugly. Okay, let's just return to this one. It doesn't really matter. But still, you want to have textures and models which match and which blend to each other, so you don't just have one huge pile of the same models, and at the same time you don't want to have a forest consisted of completely different models which just look terrible when they are next to each other. Yet another thing, bushes, and well, I've got to say that in general I tend to use only two bush models. In most of my maps you will find only two bush models used and I don't really need more. Why? Well, I don't know, I just have no need of using multiple bushes. Two are just enough. Or, again, let's ask Google if they aren't too small. This one was a little bit too big, so I've scaled it down. And now I can just start using it. Here, here, here. When it comes to bushes, you just want to make sure that your models aren't floating in the air, that they aren't like this. You want to try avoid this at any cost. But as long as you see that your models are in the ground and alright, well, you can just spam them around and it's alright. When it comes to bushes, you can really just spam them and you don't need to be too creative or too fancy about it. And notice that I have used only one bush. And it's alright. You don't need two bushes, but well, you may use multiple, but even two can be more than enough. Now I'm nearly overdoing it. Two bushes are really okay and you don't need more. When it comes to a little bit more and good terrain, well, you might want to always check if your tree is above terrain. Well, for example, this root here, is probably floating in the air. Yes, it is floating in the air. So my advice how to avoid this happening is just when you spawn a tree, select it, move it down. It isn't too hard now, is it? And I've noticed that a lot of developers just don't do it. Well, I have spawned a tree and it looks like this, so you want to avoid this. So always spawn a tree and move it down. When you don't have a luxury of completely flat plane, and you shouldn't have flat planes anyway. Anyway, well, anyway, and anywhere anyway. English is weird sometimes. Well, move your models always a little bit down, at least trees, to make sure that they are underground. You can just keep track of those, collision boxes. This collision box tells me that this part might be above terrain, and it is. Well, move it down. Right, the best thing you can do is to always make sure that whole bottom of collision box is under terrain. By doing this, you are almost sure that that no part of tree is floating above in the air. That's really all. You don't need to do more. So these are bushes and trees, and I will just talk briefly about rocks. Well, first of all, choose some rocks which match your textures very well. So let's use, well, these ones just wouldn't really work very well. So no. What about these ones? Well, they are quite reasonable. So let's use these ones. When it comes to rocks, you can't really make them too big or too small, at least most of times. And in general, what I would advise you to use are rocks which are two-sided, like this. Why? Because those two sides aren't the same. So while I've got only 5 models, I've got basically 10 different rocks because I can flip them over like this. And those bottom parts, those bottom versions are different a little bit. And I can definitely use that to my advantage. And you can do the same with rocks as you are doing with trees, so you can group them together. So you can like place some rock like this, which is high, then pick up some different one, and yet another one. You can put them into each other like this and make some sort of big rock out of them. It's like a puzzle basically. you can make such rock formations. And just one tip, try to make them climb levels so players are able to get to their top, or at least they are able of climbing on them, but we'll talk about that more in different tutorial. So these were just some thoughts. Again, you can combine rocks with bushes, so let's spawn some bushes around. It certainly looks quite well, so on. And you would also want to use some flowers. Well, there aren't many flowers in Holding Fjord, but well, this one, okay, this one doesn't really match this texture, but you can always use some flowers and they in general look very well. So you've got also something nice and pretty to put down there. I think that in Grassy Hills there were quite nice mushrooms, okay. By the way, always ask Hugo if something isn't a little bit too big. Well, you might want to have such huge mushrooms on purpose, but maybe, just maybe you want to scale them down a little bit. Okay? So always when you take some model from whatever, put that next to your Hugo or next to your human scale and check if that model isn't too big or too small for your purposes. And that's pretty much it. That's about the generic spawn. Well, try to develop some style which isn't too tedious, which you can make work even for bigger maps, because you will need to spawn thousands, dozens, hundreds and thousands of trees and bushes. Trust me, it takes a long time. So very tedious and detailed styles can be quite well dooming for your performance and for your morale. And at the same time, try to not be too lazy, because this just doesn't really look very well. And also make sure that your models look reasonable when they are next to each other. It is the best to use models from one zone. You can mix models from different zones, but make sure that they look okay when they are next to each other and that they match your textures, your ground textures. So you can use different models which are very nice, but they need to match each other. They need to blend well with each other. It's very important always. So that's pretty much it, guys. I hope this was useful for you. Take care. Say goodbye to our Hugo. Hi Hugo, our best friend. And happy modding, guys.